Good morning, Artificial Hearts family. We are back from the summer with another season of Artificial Hearts podcast. And today we have a very special guest joining us from Washington, D.C., Bill Knott. It's a pleasure to have you here. Bill Knott is the Associate Director for Religious Liberty and Public Affairs of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists.
It's good to be here. I have looked forward to this opportunity since we first made contact.
No, for sure. And we're really glad that it's finally happening. And Bill, before we begin, can you maybe just tell us a little bit more about yourself, who you are, what you're currently doing and
Sure.
your job?
I have sort of one of those eclectic careers, if you will. I trained for teaching on the secondary level in literature and religion, but didn't go that way. Ended up moving into pastoral ministry and spent 18 years as a pastor of congregations as small as 6 to as large as 1,800. So, and mostly across the northern tier of the United States. In 1997, I was invited by the world headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to come and be an associate editor of their major international journal. That ultimately became 2 international journals, and in 2006, I was elected to be the senior editor, where I worked for the next 15 years as the senior editor of journals that really reach almost half of the 22 million Adventists around the globe.
Wow, that's amazing. And I guess the question I was wondering, I think you really have a lot of your experience has been working with literature or books,
Yes,
right?
yes.
In public publications, right?
Yeah.
And how did this passion for literature emerge? What were some books maybe that you read growing up, like when you were like a teenager or younger, that you kind of really enjoyed and that really made an impact in your life?
When your father is a college literature teacher with a subspecialty in history, you kind of have some directions already pre-formed for you, not because he told us or mandated it, but I grew up among piles of books. And my first memories before I could read was taking tracing paper and tracing the fonts of the books that were all around the house.
Oh, really?
His study downstairs was perpetually just piles of books everywhere that he knew where to find things, but no one else really did. Growing up in that environment, we were encouraged to read and to read widely. Never told you ought to read this, but maybe teased and tantalized. He would frequently read poetry to us boys and would tell us some of the major narratives that he was teaching in his college literature classes. So we became familiar with, for instance, the stories of Shakespeare before we were old enough to read Shakespeare. And so it was a kind of, again, he taught American lit primarily and Victorian lit, but we ranged across almost everything, ultimately, from my case, from medieval English lit to 20th century materials, major readings kind of in each century through the era, particularly in Anglo-British, Anglo-American writing, but sampling a whole range of continental writers and even theologians as well. Yeah.
What were some like classics that I mean? You mentioned Shakespeare. Were there like some of the other like great 19th century English writers that you or your dad liked?
Oh, I read Dickens
Oh, Dickens, yeah.
voraciously as a teenager, and in fact, in many ways, would credit Dickens with helping to form a social conscience in me. There weren't many influences for an Adventist kid in a relatively small community to understand and begin to care about the wider world. But Dickens, even though he was a century and a half removed from when I read him mostly, Dickens' writing sharpened my sensibilities about people who didn't have the advantages that had come to me and the conditions that were always just out of sight for me, a middle-class boy, white boy, in a pretty safe little community. Dickens, I credit with giving me a bit of a social conscience. And then, as I grew older, I began to read the people that caused Dickens to write. People like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, utilitarians, whose writing and philosophy had created many of the conditions which Dickens protested in his novels.
Oh, they're he's protesting against them, right? Okay, that
He
makes
is. He's
right,
he's
right.
he's utterly opposed to the utilitarian philosophy
Right.
that they espoused and that had become the de rigueur way of doing economics in early 19th century Britain.
Oh wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, I really like Dickens. I always found I had like a hard time. Like I like just the style. I
Oh,
guess you really have to work that prose to appreciate it. But like A Tale of Two Cities, I really liked that work. Now you said like me, you grew up in you grew up in an Adventist home, so Bible, Ellen White. But I also wanted to know, did you like was C.S. Lewis a thing when you were growing
oh
up?
yeah, yeah.
Oh really?
Uh,
Oh,
Lewis was a companion from probably about age 12.
oh,
I began reading not primarily his imaginative literature. I actually started with Mere Christianity
oh really? Okay.
and went on to read some of the imaginative literature over the years, but I was caught by the clarity of his prose, by the self-evident rationality, if you will, of his approaches. When I learned ultimately that they were designed initially as radio presentations, I began to understand why the accessible language, the clarity, the logical proceeding. He was working as an apologist in a culture that was rapidly moving away from Christian foundations.
Wow. Yeah,
And
no,
so Lewis and ultimately some of his companions of that era became authors who were very also influential in my life, and I read widely in them. I guess I would say I just read widely because I went back not long ago and found some reading lists that had somehow been preserved from third grade in a box of collectibles I had. And I discovered that by the third quarter of
hmm.
my third grade year, when I would have been about 8, I had already read, albeit these are children's books, more than 300 volumes that
Oh
were
wow.
recorded. I just read all the time. When at school, when I came home, as long as my parents would allow me to read in the evening. And so ultimately developed a taste for things that run all across the range of both nonfiction and fiction, historical content, military history, theology, philosophy.
I also really like military history when I was like young, even
Yeah.
though I'm like a pacifist.
Yes, well, it teaches you a lot of the reasons.
Strategy.
Yes,
Yeah.
teaches you strategy, also teaches you a lot about leadership, even when you disavow the intent of military conquest.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, obviously, you talked a little bit about how a lot of these books they kind of inspired your social consciousness and kind of this awareness of what was going outside of like the small town where you were growing up. But I also want to know, were there all also like some events that kind of impacted your early life and also kind of shaped this initial career path that you took
Yeah.
with literature?
Um, the the influence of the home was probably the dominant one, but I was also fortunate to by the time I reached 18, to be settled into what was reputed to be one of the strongest literature departments at any of the faith-based colleges in the Northeast at the time. My dad happened to be one of the teachers, but it wasn't just his presence. There were some towering figures who were individuals who made the classroom experience both extremely challenging and a lot of fun at the same time. So I had significant exposure to 20th century poetry, for instance, and the 17th century devotional poets, and 18th century authors like Pope and Johnson and others whose work in their own ways inspired me. I probably a decisive element in my whole uh, attraction to literature, but also it became a turning point. I got to, in my junior year of college, third year of college, I fulfilled when you say lifelong dream and you're only 20, it sounds a little
Yeah,
odd,
yeah.
but a lifelong dream to go to Britain. And I went to school at Newbold College. Uh, that was for me as a confirmed Anglophile, just an incredible experience. Every weekend I would get a list of places where various famous British authors had lived and worked, and I would go and visit those places. I would spend my Sundays frequently in London at St. Paul's and Westminster Abbey, listening to some of the greatest preaching of the era, and then visiting the places where authors who had been particularly moving to me had lived and worked.
Did you see the
Uh,
Inklings? Sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
Uh,
pardon me?
did you see the Inklings where
I
Lewis?
didn't actually get to Oxford to see the Inklings. I was caught with places like where George Herbert lived and worked out in Salisbury. Herbert is one of those figures who, because he was also pulled, if you might say, into pastoral life, as I felt myself being pulled, I resonated with Herbert. And here's a man who had gifts in literature and poetry and music, and yet felt the call of God to go and pastor a little 30-member congregation in Bemerton St. Andrews, where he could look across the meadows at Salisbury Cathedral, where he had all of the talent to be the bishop. But he felt God's call in his life. And that was ultimately part of what my time in England did. It brought me to an awareness that while I loved literature and always will, and I love teaching and always will, that there was something even more important as a call in my own life, and I had to listen to that. It's inconvenient to make major career choices halfway through your last year of college, but that's exactly what I did.
Wow, yeah, and I imagine that must have been like a very big kind of career move to go on to this vocational calling as a pastor, as a minister. And how was kind of the process of this vocational shift, and how did you eventually, I mean, obviously you said that you went in 1997, but
Yeah,
how was kind of the process to becoming editor of Adventist Review?
sure. The because I had planned on and was on a trajectory to teach literature in the collegiate level, I ultimately did my secondary teaching and certification and student teaching, got everything I needed to be qualified, even while I felt my heart being pulled in a different direction. It was actually reading several authors while I was in England, and not some of the great literary figures. It was reading a German theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that ultimately was a real immediate cause of the pivot in my life. I began to see in Bonhoeffer's work a clarity about who Jesus was and what his call was in my life that ultimately attracted me deeply and began pulling me toward a profession that, frankly, I had thought a little about, but never seriously considered. And from the middle of my third year to the middle of my fourth year of college was a time of great wrestling where I was hearing various figures encourage me in very different directions, and yet had a deep sense that where God was leading me was toward pastoral ministry, but not a ministry as a rejection or turning my back on all that I had experienced and learned in literature, but one that was actually enriched by that, by my father's love for history and my own developing love for history. Um, Sometimes we create a false dichotomy between the worlds of literature and art and
Yeah,
history
yeah.
and the worlds of theology and pastoral care. And ultimately, when we look back at Christian history, the people we often admire the most in pastoral ministry and theology are the people who had deep and wide experience of literature and art and history, and that informed their best writing and thinking and preaching. And to me, I saw those as useful and powerful backgrounds to where I felt God was calling me.
And just to take advantage of of that kind of segue, I think a lot of people today from communities of faith, they really have questions and they debate among themselves, like what is good literature or like what
Hmm.
is good entertainment. And like you said, some people they have kind of a fear of, oh, we can't go into literature because it's going to take us down this rabbit hole that is going to make us compromise our faith or our belief systems. What have been like some good or useful principles that you've applied for discerning what constitutes like a good artwork, or do you think there are principles that maybe we can apply in making these kinds of choices on our art and our entertainment?
Well, I used to be really sure about things like this. And then life has a way of softening the edges of your hard-edged viewpoints when you're a young adult, as in my case, and I began to see that in reality, my definitions of what made for good art, and by that I mean literature, graphic arts, poetry, music, what made for good art was actually the investment of time and quality and the thought that framed that experience. I began to grow less doctrinaire that it had to be something based on factual experience. For me, there's been a debate in our conservative Protestant community about fiction for many years, because many people wrongly assume they understand the definitions of fiction from the 19th century that were operative at the time our faith community was formed. Because my dad taught literature and taught fictive literature, I got an early education in understanding the terminology and the meaning of that. And in fact, fascinatingly, a key figure in our faith movement, Ellen White, who wrote about some of the dangers of fiction, would have found herself in almost complete agreement with Nathaniel Hawthorne, the author of some of the greatest of American fictive pieces. Ellen White was criticizing the exact same kinds of writing that Hawthorne himself was criticizing. People who were writing only to stir the emotions, only to keep the reader going so they could sell more books, what we would call the equivalent of the Harlequin romance of today. Nathaniel Hawthorne, in fact, ended up being an author that early Seventh-day Adventists republished. Hawthorne's Celestial Railroad, which is a kind of somewhat contemptuous send-up of the Transcendentalists of the 1840s, was republished by Seventh-day Adventist publishing presses for 30 years because it was a critique of a social philosophy that was taking people, they believed, away from a biblical faith.
Yeah, no, I find that so fascinating, what you just said. You might actually find this interesting. I did some research down there where you're at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists at their archives. You know what I found? I found like so many. I'm a huge Victor Hugo fan. I
Oh,
found like,
yes.
yeah, right. I found a bunch of like quotes from Victor Hugo in like the Sentinel on these like early
Oh, yeah.
Seventh-day Adventist publications, especially his anti-clericalism. I think they really like that.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, what was inspiring to me when I ultimately moved into an editorial role was to see how richly my predecessors as editors had drawn on literary
Yeah.
figures, historical studies, all kinds of content that served their moral purposes. And whatever one thinks of Hugo as a writer, there's no denying that he writes from a broadly moral sense. Ellen White writes from that same moral sense. Many of the great authors of the 19th century whose work has been anthologized wrote from that same moral sense. I referred to Dickens as having helped form that social consciousness in me. Again, that's one of the definitions of art. Does it move people toward good? That doesn't mean that everything is cheerful and sunny and bright. Certainly, many of the greatest authors did not frame their works in some kind of sweet and happy world, but they stirred us to look at the powerful themes in human experience that are underpinned by moral questions.
Yeah, I think, and maybe just to go on this a little bit longer, and I think maybe one of the mistakes, I think a lot of like what you see kind of like in the more like kind of conservative Protestant evangelical world, I think people confuse art maybe with the purpose of theology, because I think in theology we're defining, right? We're
Yeah.
defining doctrines of faith. We're defining these very core, crucial, essential normative matters that will guide our lives. As opposed to, I think, art, you're taking a few steps back and you're
Yes.
making people question, right? Like, why? What is this, right? You're actually making them. You're creating these characters that they have different personalities, and obviously, I think you can communicate a message through that, but not everybody's gonna have the same voice, right? Not everybody's gonna speak the same. You're gonna have. I mean, if kind of going like these characters in Hawthorne, they don't all speak the same. Sometimes they have very different lifestyles. They have very different personalities. It's almost like children that you have that make life choices
Yeah.
that you don't necessarily agree with, right?
And that's a lot like real human experience. And I say that on the strength of 18 years as a pastor. The variety of human beings that you experience in a typical congregation is well reflected in the great literature of the world. We have in every congregation people who are striving to do right and organizing their life by the principles of Jesus. And we have also individuals struggling hugely with just some of the existential questions of life. They've been attracted to faith, but it has not yet made much of an impact on their lives.
Exactly. And that so you have this passion for literature. You're working as a pastor. How was the experience going to work for the major Seventh-day Adventist publication, the publication of your faith community? Well, what were some of the challenges that you experienced in this kind of new capacity? You know, I guess working for a church that has a presence in over 193 countries or more of the 200 and plus recognized countries of the world. How was kind of this experience of going from like a small town and now you're in this major editorial capacity?
At first, I had difficulty envisioning the opportunity when it came to me. And I wrestled with it for some weeks. And my friends were all calling and saying, Bill, this is you. Just say yes, and you'll figure it out. Well, ultimately, I began to see a continuity between that calling in my life to be a pastor and the opportunity to continue that same role, what I would call a ministry, on a much broader stage with a much wider congregation. I won't go quite so far as John Wesley and say the world is my parish, but on some level, you begin to recognize that the words you sit and write at 5 a.m. staring out into the blackness of the backyard before sunrise, they're going to be read by 8 or 9 million people around the world. You think up very carefully, and yes, you pray very deeply about what to write, whether it's significant enough for that many people to use their time and all the resources that are put into distributing it. So I began to see a continuity between that calling in my life to be a pastor and the work I did as an editor. The actual day-to-day work moved rather quickly over the years from primarily what I'd call editorial work, both authoring and editing, to increasingly management. You are ultimately building an editorial team. You're looking for talented authors and editors, and as new media emerged, looking for people who could both innovate and manage new media platforms. And that process ultimately became more administrative than it did creative. I still had a portion of my time, maybe 20%, where I could do the creative work, and I loved it, and I still do. But increasingly, it was managing the platforms that helped create content in all kinds of ways, well beyond print, which is where I had started.
Do you feel like there was a challenge? I mean, because obviously the viewership is so wide because you're getting people from like around the world. Was that also maybe like a challenge, and how did you manage that?
Well, we had two major magazines when I became the senior editor, Adventist Review, which was the journal founded before the church was organized. I used to tease the senior officers of the church that the Adventist Review, being 14 years older than the denomination, what they had really done is just take the Adventist Review subscription list and make it the membership list of the church. And there's a lot of truth really in that laugh line. The magazine really was the core around which the movement formed. And so there's that historic journal, small, subscription based. And then there was the free distribution monthly of a journal printed in almost 2 million copies a month around the world in 10 different languages and distributed electronically via social media and all kinds of platforms. That magazine, Adventist World, occupied a huge piece of our time and attention. And of course, it occupied a lot of financial space as well. When you think about trying to put a print magazine in 10 languages and do that compatibly with what other regions of the world church are doing with their journals, you spend a lot of time organizing contracts and print deals, and we were purchasing in any given year hundreds of tons of paper and shipping them internationally. So a lot of management related details. So you find specialists who can help you in each of these areas, even while you keep that core group of authors together. One of the real challenges of that international work is trying to get outside of our North American skin, if you will. We hired a diverse team, but that diverse team, most all of them still lived in the eastern half of the United States. And that means there are sensibilities, there are cultural assumptions that are made when you do that. I used to regularly tell our team, we need to imagine that our editorial offices are not here in the Washington, D.C. metro region, but perhaps on the west coast of Africa would be a good focal point for us to think about. That means that our illustrations, our assumptions, our graphics, our color schemes, our fonts, every piece of how we communicate must be adapted to people who don't share our life story and experience in North America. And we have to, in fact, learn how to share their stories and experiences if we're going to communicate, if we're going to do more than simply pass along our North Americanness. So that magazine particularly taught me to not only investigate closely, but embrace other cultural experiences, listen to the ways other people choose to communicate, and be informed about how better to run global enterprises like what Adventist World ultimately became.
Wow, that's amazing. And I guess like you must have I mean, with all these years of experience working for this huge for both of these two very big companies. I'm kind of wondering what kind of advice or what kind of life lessons would you give for any kind of aspiring young writer wanting to get into kind of the publication field? What are
Sure.
good things to have in mind working at a publication company or at a publishing house?
Well, I'll tell you what I told a young man this last Saturday afternoon. I was at a small conference and had a presentation to make, and he was interested in what I said, and we struck up a conversation. And I could tell, based on where he was going to school and what he was doing, that he's a man of ideas, who's clearly got talent. I know a bit about his family history, and there are very talented authors and thinkers in his family tree. And I said, hey, would you send me something you've written? I said, I can't assure you, like I could have a couple of years ago, that we could move something forward into print, but I'm always fascinated to find young adults who are creating content. I get many queries that say, what should I write about? And I say, write about something you're passionate about. Don't write about something you think I'm passionate about. Write about something you care deeply about. Obviously, do that in a way that's accessible, in a way that's restrained so that you can convince rather than overwhelm. Do that in a way that communicates that you have your whether it's a moral viewpoint or an ethical perspective you have, or a social point you wish to make, or even a political point. I encourage people, write about what you're passionate about. Don't waste your time and your good effort by trying to imagine what an editor is going to like. If the editor knows his business, he doesn't only look for content in one narrow channel. Increasingly, editors are looking across the range of human endeavor, the many, many academic and disciplines and life areas, and looking for fresh, original thinking. The editor's job is to weld those into a journal, to make it readable and accessible to authors who to readers who haven't had that author's life story. But again, often I tell young adults, send me something, whatever. Go through the stuff that you've kept on your laptop and hit the forward button on a couple of things. And from those, I've ended up publishing a great many young adults who didn't imagine themselves as published authors yet because they kept waiting for a certain gravitas to come into their lives. Actually, the gravitas comes with the writing and the doing and the ability to communicate. Once you're published, other people notice. You get invitations. Uh, I go in when I teach seminars on writing and getting published. I talk about some life habits that help undergird that. One is simply the habit of writing, whether uh, uh, instead of waiting for the muse to strike, keeping a journal, a daily blog, if you will. Some choose to publish that. In my case, I usually kept my scribblings to myself and only put out there something that I thought might be worthwhile of other people's attention. But the habit of writing about life, um, noting your own observations, uh, catching uh, being able to describe a scene you're envisioning or a human moment you've experienced. Uh, the the eyesight to see the world around you and your potential for communicating it is what that journal or that blog will ultimately record. To this day, I go back to journals I kept when I was that student in England almost 50 years ago. And I pull up themes that I sketched there and I write about them 50 years later because some of the words I put on in those journals 50 years ago still are useful to people.
When it comes to writing, would you say you're more of a minimalist or a maximalist? Like, do you like more kind of that Hemingway iceberg effect of kind of using short sentences and letting the reader kind of find out, or are you more like you're okay with like going into kind of like the detail and going kind of like a David Foster Wallace? Well, I mean, maybe not that much, but
I I don't mean to sound cheeky, but I would tell you it depends on what time of day.
gotcha. Okay.
When I get up in the morning, I write my cleanest, clearest prose.
Mm.
My sentence structure is accessible and relatively short. As the day goes on, and apparently my mind gets tired, I lapse into a kind of subtext of Victorian prose, which Dickens would be proud of, and Matthew Arnold and a few others.
50
These
word
long,
sentences.
oh, in long, complicated sentence structures, and to the point where I require an editor myself by the end of the day. I would say my preferred style is what I write in the morning, which is why I chose to do most of my significant writing in the early hours of the morning, because my mind is rested, my language is structured in a way that is more accessible to people. And when I go back and read it, I like it better than what I produce later in the day. I would lean toward minimalism, but I could tell you that some of the work I've done looks like I've been reading the Victorians again recently. And their preference for long, engaged sentence structures and paragraphs. And, you know, when you go look at some of Dickens, and one paragraph will take you on to 2.5 pages.
Wow. And as we wrap up this first block, I just wanted to ask you, I think we live today in kind of a world where even the forms of like recreation and entertainment are changing with like the technology and all that we're seeing. And it's very easy, I think, to get distracted. Why do you think a good book is still worth reading?
There is, in fact, I've been reading some articles that are actually drawing on very recent research that the tactile experience of holding a book and touching pages
Mm.
it creates greater retention of content than even the exact content in digital format. Some significant research is emerging that underscores why books read often have a greater impact on the reader than reading the same content in digital format. Uh, that isn't just a bias and a preference. There's now some science behind that as well. It happens to confirm my bias, which
Right.
is that holding something and the sense of smell and holding an old volume and the texture of the pages and my ability to make notes in the margin, and I underline generously and I call my own attention back to passages I want to remember. That whole physical experience for me reinforces the importance of books. And frankly, if in fact the world was all going digital and books were going to disappear, it would have happened already. The digital world has been around long enough now that no one is actually trumpeting that books are going to disappear or that journals are going to disappear or that magazines are going to disappear. Hundreds of new magazine titles emerge every year in the market. Thousands of book titles are published in hardbound or paperbound copies new titles every year. There is a persistent and I think enduring value for the experience of reading a volume, a journal, something that you hold and that you have the chance to touch, go back to, flip easily around in, go back and check to see an allusion in a previous chapter. All of those things are a bit more limited in the digital world.
Wow. And on that note, before we move on to our next segment, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Artificial Hearts Podcast is brought to you by Artificial Hearts, LLC, the podcast of Artificial Hearts, a podcast designed to warming and humanizing the hearts that have become cold through secular humanism, through the writings of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Don't also forget to get our t-shirt and like and subscribe our channel. And don't forget your compliment, our mug that we have on our website. You can buy it now on our digital web store. Now, Bill, you recently were nominated to serve as an ambassador for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, for the worldwide Seventh-day Adventist Church, I should say. So how was the change from working as a publisher, I guess, which is something more, you're not, I guess when you're writing, you're not, or maybe, well, I guess you are because you're observing a lot, you have for you to be a good writer, right? But I guess this ambassador role, right? You're dealing with politicians, with all these kinds of folks. So how was the shift in focus from working in your previous role to the one that you're working now?
Well, truthfully, this can sound a little cheeky, but I finally found my dream job
Awesome.
near the end of my career. When I was a teenager, and actually it was the summer of 1973. My father, fascinated with American politics, and took our family on a summer trip to Washington, D.C. at the height of the Watergate hearings. You'll remember the crisis that engulfed Richard Nixon's presidency, where he had authorized break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters and then covered that up, and the crisis that ultimately brought down his presidency. In August of 1973, the Watergate hearings, the select committee that was investigating this, was meeting in the Capitol. And we went and visited, and I stood outside the committee room and watched the national broadcasts taking place from there, and got autographs from many of the leading senators who were on that committee, and just was thoroughly intoxicated. I had already been following political life since I was about age 11, very closely, to the point that I was probably more of a political nerd than I was anything else in those years. And so when my family went and traveled and I got to go to DC and see all of this, I was completely taken. And I thought, wow, this would be a fascinating life. It was, I believe, on that same trip that I first discovered that my faith community, the church I belonged to, had a representative on Capitol Hill. And I thought, they pay someone to do this? This sounds like an amazing opportunity. But, it never happened to come around at a moment in my life when it looked likely. I moved into a pastoral career, and from then into an editorial career. And ultimately in 2022, I wrote to my board before an upcoming series of reappointment schedules. And I said to them, look, I've loved doing this editorial work. It has been the privilege of a lifetime to work with people around the world, but I want to do something, and I use the expression fun and life-giving, near the end of my career. And at that moment, I didn't know what that would be. I was literally looking. And many of my peers and many of my board members said, why, don't leave this, stay here, do this work. And I said, it's important work and I honor it, but I want to do something that for me brings joy and spontaneity back into my life. Literally 3 weeks later, this opportunity to be the Washington, D.C. liaison, the Congressional Hill liaison for the Seventh-day Adventist World Church, opened up. No one saw that coming or expected that. And when they turned to me and said, would you be interested in this? I tried not to drool, I'll have to say. I did my best to not, jump too quickly. I wanted to give at least a pause before I said yes. I did talk with my wife, and she said, you're going to say yes, I know. And it's true. It captured me because I had secretly hoped for 50 years that opportunity would come to me. And in the process of moving into this new role, I have found it to be so much of what I had hoped it would be. Oh, there's a bit more drudgery in it, just as there is in every job. It's not all fun and engagement. But I will tell you, it has in many ways reinvigorated my belief that the faith I belong to must be actively engaged in the public square, must be actively involved in making itself known and being understood, communicating its value system, even while it listens to value systems that come from very different sources than its own. And the opportunity to do that, to explain my faith community, to represent it, to watch out for its interests, that is a never-ending source of intrigue for me and enjoyment that has really fulfilled my goals of being fun and life-giving while also providing meaningful employment.
And maybe just for our viewers who might not be so familiar with like the role or the functions of a public affairs director,
Yeah.
yeah, what are some of like the tasks that you have to carry out as director of public affairs? And I also want to know who's like some cool people that you got to meet on
Yeah.
this job representing your church.
The in many ways, I have to smile when people ask me about my job description, because if you were to read it, you would probably laugh out loud as well. It's basically represent the church to the White House, to the U.S. Congress, to all of the international embassies in Washington, D.C., and all of the international agencies that make their headquarters in D.C. And there's one of me. That is, as you say, almost laughable. So you have to constantly be sorting and filtering to say, where are the interests of my faith community most focused right now? Is it on working with an embassy to help create better understanding of our faith community in their region? Is it working on Capitol Hill with a piece of legislation that could affect the interests of Seventh-day Adventists? I'll give you as an illustration. There was a recent bill introduced that sought to protect the rights of faith-based organizations to their historic tax-exempt status in American culture. That bill was introduced because several federal rulings in some lower courts have challenged that status recently. Well, I got to sit with several colleagues from another region, the North American division of the church, sitting in the senator's office with his staff and talk about the merits of the bill, hoping to help them become sponsors of that legislation to create a bipartisan coalition in favor of a piece of legislation that directly impacts the Seventh-day Adventist community and, by the way, every other community of faith, Christian or not. So there's also monitoring the decisions of the judiciary. Just over a year and a half ago, a major case reached the U.S. Supreme Court that directly dealt with the issue of Sabbath keeping. A man whose Sabbath, his chosen day of worship, happens to be Sunday. He's very devoutly keeps it as a 24-hour day of rest, much as Seventh-day Adventists keep Saturday as a 24-hour day of rest. He had been a Postal Service employee, and that he had worked out accommodations for years. But when the Postal Service took on the Amazon contract for package delivery on Sundays, they said, you've got to work on your day of rest. He protested this, and they said, no exemptions. He ultimately brought suit by seeking out a Seventh-day Adventist attorney who handles religious liberty cases. That attorney moved it through the early stages. It went to the appellate level, and ultimately the case was accepted on the docket of the U.S. Supreme Court, and in April 2023 came to hearing and was ultimately adjudicated a year ago, June, in favor, by the way, of that Sabbath keeper, and broadly extended protections for people of faith in their workplaces.
Did we write sorry, I'm just curious. Did we write an amicus brief? Do you remember for that?
Yes, Seventh-day Adventist Church filed amicus briefs along with many, many other religious organizations who understood that the principles involved would have an impact on their faith community too. Representatives of Jewish and Muslim faith groups filed amicus briefs. Most of the major religious liberty legal firms in DC filed amicus briefs. And ultimately, what emerged was one of the most striking moments in the recent history of the U.S. Supreme Court. Unanimous decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court are as rare as my grandmother would have said hen's teeth. They just don't happen. And yet, in that case of in June of 23, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the plaintiff and insisted on a more expansive definition of worker protection, faith protection in the workplace that affected not only Sabbath keepers, but will have an impact on religious stress in the workplace, on religious behaviors that are tolerated in the workplace. It now places a greater burden on the employer to accommodate than had previously been there. Previously, the employer can say, it's not working, you're out of here. Now they have to accommodate that worker and show good faith that they've worked hard to find a solution to the problems.
Wow, that's amazing. That's actually something because I'm writing now my dissertation, so that case is something specifically, but that's for another podcast. Bill, we have here a lot of young viewers at Artificial Hearts who really want to make a positive impact in society. Yeah. And I know that part of public affairs is not only working with religious liberty, but also inspiring people, to be good to be good citizens within their faith communities. And what advice would you give to maybe some of our young followers who really want to make a positive impact in society in these areas of justice, but don't know how? What are positive ways of engaging with this? And how do you kind of avoid maybe the negatives, that having that zeal, but channeling it the wrong way?
Many years ago in the editorial office, I worked with an incredibly talented and very passionate young assistant editor. He wrote really beautiful prose. He had clear viewpoints, and he grew frustrated with the inability of his prose to move the system in the ways he wished. And one day, in a particularly strong exchange, he spoke very passionately about what he didn't like about the way he couldn't move the system forward. And I asked him a question which at the moment may have sounded a bit too strong, but it went this way. Do you want to make a difference, or do you just want to make noise? Now that sounds a bit cynical, and I've since apologized to him for the way I framed it that day, but it's actually at its core, it embraces a really important question. Do you want to make a difference, or do you want to make noise? There is a great deal of focus in our society today about what I would call the public protest. And I honor that. Some significant civil rights advances have come directly through that. I've written extensively about Adventists involved in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and engaged with anti-slavery efforts in the 1850s and protecting the rights of minority communities through the decades. So I honor those who do go in the public square with the picket sign and they sign the petition. But I ultimately point people, particularly young adults, who want to make a difference, to attaching themselves to an advocacy organization where their efforts can actually move forward in very specific and targeted ways. For instance, I encourage young adults, if you have skills or even passions to be involved in the legislative process about issues you care about, seek out internships in legislative offices. Attach yourself to an office of a legislator who shares your same belief system. Ask for opportunities to work on projects in your community that forward your own moral vision of how your community ought to be taking care of people or treating people. Often those more targeted ways aren't as satisfying in the early going as the protest sign or the petition. But ultimately, there's few things more satisfying than seeing change happen because you were part of a broader effort that may have been focused on someone else's legislative bill, but you know that you did the lobbying behind that opened the doors that made that a reality. I'm looking for things that move the needle. Most young adults are too, and I steer them. Look at internships, look at volunteer experiences. I just talked with a young man who recently spent time working on political campaigns of candidates he believed in. And when he told me that about one of them who had won a recent election, and I smiled and said that was a really interesting race. And I saw the satisfaction on his face because he knew that in some tangible way he had contributed to the electoral success of a candidate he really identified with. Well, that sense of satisfaction is contagious. It's self-repeating. You want to keep doing more of that. So I encourage people, apply for every internship you think might be related. Look around. And if you don't know where to look, talk to some of us who work with advocacy agencies in DC who are always looking for talented interns, people who can gain valuable life experience and references from that time.
Well, fantastic. And on that note, as we all know, we're in an election cycle
Yes.
here, and you know more than I do the Seventh-day Adventist position on nonpartisanship. But I do know this is always a time where things can get very polarizing. People lose friendships, like they take it very personally. And I think from your experience working at being in DC, being in the belly of the beast, as we might say, how can sincere people of faith in this election cycle kind of remain focused on the essential? We know we're going to have Seventh-day Adventists, we're going to vote Democrat, Republican, Independent, all across the party line. So how can we kind of avoid the partisan politics during this election cycle and focus on kind of like what matters? And also, how can we kind of avoid getting into partisan politics?
Many of the early leaders of our faith community wrote extensively about what we will today call political issues. If you go back to the early decades of the magazine that I ultimately edited, and it was full of what we would recognize as very strong political perspectives. They did not take them because a party advocated for those. They took them because they saw the moral underpinnings of the issue. So early Seventh-day Adventists were unanimous in their abolitionism and their attack on slavery and on the U.S. government for tolerating slavery is some of the strongest prose you will ever read in the history of our faith community. The attack on big corporate greed in the era we now know to be dominated by the robber barons of the late 19th and early 20th century. The attack on that they focused on those who unfairly manipulated the poor and took away the freedoms of working men and women to be involved in thinking about their lives together. The magazine, as I learned from reading extensively in its archives, was full of political opinion, but it was not full of what we would call partisan politics. The distinction is politics is not itself a bad thing. We have to define that carefully. Politics means simply the business of the people. It doesn't mean that I am a partisan for one party or another. And the early leaders of our faith community were insistent. Get engaged, but don't get engaged uniquely with one party and only with that group, because you will be led astray by doing so. You will be tempted to compromise on things one ought not to compromise on. There is no political party that ever gets it all right. And therefore, what we used to call straight ticket voting, where you went in and simply cranked one lever and voted for all of the candidates of that party, would be something our faith community has warned people against. Think carefully about each candidate, their positions. Always, they're going to be difficult choices to make. I was talking with a family member recently, and they were describing their preferences in the presidential campaign and in the U.S. Senate campaign being waged in our home state here in Maryland, and describing how they favored the candidate of one party for president and favored the candidate of another party for U.S. Senate, and actually felt that the best outcome, in their point of view, that we might achieve as a nation is, again, a kind of divided government in which there are checks and balances and no one gets to insist on their way with unanimity. That was their viewpoint. I applauded their decision to not simply vote in a party manner, in a fashion that embraced one flag of one party or one color on the map, but to actually think carefully about the positions of each candidate. And that gets increasingly difficult as the ballot gets longer every year, as you're voting in this, as we will in this election, not only for president of the United States, but in many states, senators, and every state, congressmen, and state senators, state legislators, and in many cases, judges. So there's a huge range of candidates and issues. It means being an informed voter and taking the time to become acquainted with the issues and the candidates instead of waiting till election day and waiting for an impulse to strike.
Perfect. And I think those are great. And I really hope that we as a people can take that advice that you just gave us, especially as we kind of near this election cycle. And Bill, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, this very insightful conversation, I kind of wanted to end with culture. I think we talked a little bit about academia.
Yeah.
We talked about even politics we touched on, and I wanted to end our conversation on culture.
Yeah.
And in light of that, how do you think that Christians, people of sincere faith, even outside the Christian community, how can they make a positive impact on culture in what some would call a quote unquote a post-Christian culture, a post-God culture that many say the U.S. is becoming?
I'm fascinated by the role that well-trained, thoughtful Christians can have in our culture by their ability to write, to speak, and to communicate, and to earn that space in which their Christian faith informs what they do, but their sensibilities and their skill as communicators gets them audiences. And you can look across the range of what's published today, and you will find a lot of people who put out a lot of chatter, but then you will find a core of Christian thinkers and authors and speakers who have an impact. I think of a young man I met almost 20 years ago in my PhD program at George Washington. I was fascinated by how he spoke even in class. He spoke in sound bites. And I thought, who is this man? And how does he have this incredibly compact way of speaking forceful, clear thoughts? I discovered that, in fact, he was a voice I recognized. He was one of 3 weekly commentators on NPR. He was the designated conservative. Now he was down doing his PhD in American religious history as well. And I became friends with him in the process. And we got to go up and visit the NPR office, and I began listening and reading his material. He was a clear, incisive writer who was becoming a leading figure in many Christian circles and well beyond because of his social commentary. His viewpoints were clearly infused with his Christian faith, but he had earned readers outside of Christianity because he was speaking to contemporary issues from that broadly moral viewpoint. And to this day, he's gone on to teach in several colleges and universities. His blogs are highly read and widely read because he finds a way to communicate what he cares about in faith with what his culture cares about in issues. And he walks that line with great skill. I look to him as an author whose work illustrates the role that a Christian intellectual can have. And by intellectual, I don't mean someone with important degrees that follow their name. I mean someone who can communicate clearly, use their mind, and listen well, be engaged in dialogue, think with other people, tolerate different points of view. Those are the hallmarks of Christian intellectuals through the centuries, whether or not they had academic degrees.
And as we wrap up, I want to end with our last question that we ask all our guests. Bill, Artificial Hearts is a podcast dedicated to humanizing the hearts that have become cold through secular humanism by readapting Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov to a popular audience and reinvigorating and restoring Western culture with the timeless truths and values of the Christian gospel. So in light of that, how do you believe that literature and also the work of political or of public affairs can help us become more human and more open to faith and the possibility of God and find meaning in life?
Christianity has always had at least two major dimensions. One is that personal interior life, your life with God. We focus on that, and particularly in conservative Christian communities, we focus a great deal on that life of piety. But Christianity, by the fact that it exists on the earth, and it has structures, and it has believers, and must engage with social issues, Christianity also has to have an impact on its culture. It must stand up and protest when the poor are abused, when the rights of minorities are trampled on. Christianity must engage to say, this represents our best values in the culture. Let's stay away from these things. Let's move toward these. Christianity thus has a guiding and shaping force in its culture, as well as that life of piety and inner devotion. And for me, the finest role Christians can play is both to have a rich inner life and a rich public life, to have a life that both is communicating with God and others in the Christian community, but also is accessible to people who don't share my faith assumptions. I want to be understood by people where I work today who don't start where I start, but I want them to have some grasp of what I believe, and I want to understand what they believe, so that when the tense, difficult moments come, and they will come in our future, we will have some human understanding of each other in those moments.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for watching our episode of Artificial Hearts. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more of this amazing content like you just saw with Bill Knott. Please continue to support our platform by your likes, subscriptions, and also helping us support with our merchandise. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.